Okay, guys, here's your video lecture for this past week. I want to dive into just a couple questions here. One of the main ones that people asked was about the Gothic style. What exactly was that, and how did it come about? And how does it influence us to this very day? Gothic is a weird word. It's changed its meaning over time greatly, like at least three times. Um, The Goths themselves were a group of people in the Germanic tribe that sacked Rome, and that was, this kind of earth-shattering event where Rome fell, the city of Rome, which hadn't happened until then. Even Hannibal, as dominant as he was in the field in the early battles of the Punic War, Second Punic War, um, he never actually got to Rome. He did not sack the city, and the Goths got that done. And adding to kind of the humiliation of this is the Goths weren't the Carthaginians. This was a tribal folk that were coming out of Germany, and they did not have Hannibal's military genius or forces, but they were able to defeat Rome. Um, Now, that was a negative thing to most folks, except for the Goths themselves, I guess. And it kind of shook up the ancient world in many ways. The old certainties had finally completely fallen, and a new order had come into the world. And so Goth was originally a kind of negative term, and that negative term stayed with um, it for a very long time. So as the architecture of the Middle Ages that was called Gothic was very different from what came before it. Peaked windows and domes instead of arches, lots and lots of glass in buildings. And one thing to realize is how miraculous some of these buildings would have looked to people of that time. If you're used to seeing things built with stone, right? You're used to seeing. Think about the ancient world, the much more ancient world with those massive pyramids. And I pointed out that pyramids appear all over the world, not because aliens taught people how to do it, but because that's the only way to build a very tall structure out of stone. It can't be done any other way. And so most stone buildings were not great, humongously, huge things. You did see some of this kind of stuff in Rome at the height of Rome's power. The Pantheon, for instance, which is still standing to this very day, they don't know how they did it, the Romans. They don't know how the Romans did this thing with concrete. The building is built mostly of concrete, the Pantheon is. And I'll put a link to it so you can see what I know it's in your book, but I'll put a link to it here. Um, it's one continuous pour of concrete that makes that enormous dome of the Pantheon. And we can't do that today. But as Rome fell apart and as society kind of collapsed, for a while there, all you saw in these massive buildings was just kind of decay. Things had run down. And as we get into the late Middle Ages, Rome was a dump. It was just basically a little backwards town. Its population had dwindled to next to nothing. The Colosseum, the great big arena that was in the heart of Rome, at the low point of Rome's existence, it was out in a pasture. It was literally people were grazing their crops around the uh, Colosseum. And so people could look at these amazing feats of engineering, and like I said, we still don't know today how they did some of that stuff. Um, and the Gothic arises out of this kind of situation. And the Gothic is very different, and it takes the wonders that Rome was able to build and puts, does it with steroids, right? It's these enormously tall buildings made of stone that have this amazing amount of glass in them. Anyone looking at one of these things coming from the Roman culture, of the older Roman culture, would have wondered how in the world is the thing standing up, right? Um, all that glass and all those windows, all that empty space in this enormous building. And that's kind of the engineering feats that the people who built the Gothic cathedrals and buildings were able to do were just incredible in that way. However, to get back to our situation with the Goths and the word Gothic, there was a school of thought in the world of art and architecture in the Middle Ages that really looked back to Rome and Greece as the high point of civilization. And what they wanted to do was simply reawaken, recreate that classical kind of art and architecture. The word classical, in the context of a class like this, means stuff that the Greeks and Romans did. And the Greeks and Romans were all about a certain kind of aesthetic, a certain kind of way of appreciating art, and they were all about balance and symmetry. And the Gothic doesn't have a lot of balance and symmetry to it. They're just building these things as high as they can make them and throwing as many windows in them as they can. Um, and so the kind of the people that were really wanting to preserve and to redo classical art really looked down upon the people who were building these other kinds of things that looked very, very different from what the Romans and Greeks did. And they called it Gothic as a negative term, as a pejorative. They were looking down their noses at these people building these things that are not classical, and they said they were Gothic. But the Gothic took over, and people loved the Gothic, and it just became a thing in its own right, right? Became instead of a negative in terms of the people of that age that were building these things, became a positive. We're building Gothic, and they were very proud of the fact that they could do things that the Romans and the Greeks could not do, and that what they did was different. It was a new civilization that was rising out of the ashes of the old civilization. And as we get into the Renaissance, you'll see this kind of stuff just kind of accelerate. But the Gothic architecture was the first real sign of Western civilization arising again out of the disaster of the fall of Rome. And so people began to take very much pride in this stuff. Now, Gothic today, right, means people wandering around with a lot of black on, right, full-length black coats and black makeup, and it's a kind of subculture rooted mostly in music, but also in fashion, even art and literature to some degree, and that's called Gothic. And the way that happens is kind of odd. So you've got these great, humongous Gothic buildings and Gothic settings and Gothic art that was largely associated with the church. Many of these Gothic buildings are cathedrals, and you have to remember that Europe was unified in terms of Christianity. It was Roman Catholic. And there are a number of questions kind of about that, a couple that I'm going to deal with. But this was kind of the setting of church stuff, religious things. When you go into a cathedral that's in the Gothic style, you're supposed to feel awe and wonder and a connection to God in this great, beautiful building with all its stained glass and stuff. And they really are gorgeous buildings. If you want to see a small Gothic church, the one in Okarche is probably the most beautiful building in Oklahoma. You can see what that looks like. But the Romantics, which come along later, they're a group of writers and musicians and people in the early 19th century folks, late 17th century, they were all about emotion. They loved the idea of creating an emotional response in the audience, and so one of the things they did was some of the Romantics wrote these really scary stories, Dracula and Frankenstein. And in order to increase the kind of horror value, right, the kind of they wanted their audience to feel, they set these things in Gothic settings. And so you've got the monster Dracula, the blood-sucking creature of the night, inhabiting these Gothic spaces and making the Gothic spaces not places of wonder and grandeur and religious feelings, but places of kind of a creeping sort of something's wrong here, by juxtaposing, right, the evil, creepy stuff with this architecture that was supposed to have the kind of opposite effect. And so that then, when the Goths came along as a music subculture, they were like, yeah, this is cool. And so they adopted this. And so this kind of Gothic stuff, right, has changed its meaning. and now it means dark and creepy. And so that's how that came about over several hundreds of years, right? More than 1,000. This change takes place. More than 1,000, close to 1,000. Um, so that's how that happened. So and today you see it in like Batman. Um, if you have a modern horror thing, like they did a remake of Dracula not too long ago, it's all in Gothic, settings. Um, Batman, Gotham City, but why is it called Gotham? Um, the guy that invented Batman and wrote those comics. Although there's controversy there, the guy that actually invented Batman didn't get credit for it, like so many things happen. But there's a reason that Gotham is this Gothic architecture and this dark bat-like creature of the night, right? That's good, but not kind of. And that's something to know, guys. I used to get comic books when I was a kid, and I'm old now. But you could get a 100-page comic book for 50 cents in the mail. And Batman in the early days was a dark, dark thing. It was creepy. There's one of my I remember to this day one of my favorite Batmans. Um, there's no dialogue at all. He says no word in the whole thing. This family gets murdered in the alley, and it's kind of like a recreation of how Batman, Bruce Wayne, lost his parents. And these guys, the thugs that do this, they drive off, and then you see Batman like brooding over the city, standing up there like a gargoyle, and looking down at this. And the rest of the comic book, he hunts them down and kills them one at a time. Um, the Batman not using guns, right, in the old days, was because he liked to get more up close and personal when he killed someone. And so there was a lot more of the Gothic in Batman in the early comic books. And for that reason, for the same reason that Dracula's in a Gothic setting, and Frankenstein and the Wolfman, all these kind of archetypal monsters. Um, had a question about scarification and tattooing, and the question was, how long has this been going on? And the answer is forever. The Iceman that they found, a guy that had been a prehistoric guy that was frozen in a glacier, and so they got this body fairly intact. I'll put a link to that too. He's got tattoos on him. People have been tattooing and decorating their body in permanent ways and making scars in interesting patterns for a very, very long time. And I don't know why that is. We could speculate about that, but it's certainly true. And it's become more a part of our culture. When I was a kid, if you had a tattoo, you'd either been in the Navy in World War II, or you were a lunatic, right? A tattoo is a way of saying I am out there. Now everybody has tattoos, so it's not nearly as out there. But that has changed over the last like 30, 40 years. A question about the flagellants, right? These guys going along, whipping themselves during the plague. An extreme reaction, right? And there's a negative strain of Christianity. The hatred of the body, the obsession with sin, that was present in the Middle Ages, and it's still present today. People still harm themselves in the name of overcoming what they feel to be sinful or compulsive or whatever. And you can kind of see how in a culture like that people would go there. Became a fad almost, became a fanaticism. And when everybody's dying around you, right, the Black Death, it's like this seems like a way to respond to that. Maybe God will let up on us if we hurt ourselves enough. It's an ugly idea about the way that Christianity works, and it's bad theology also. Um, the church, the actual official Catholic Church, condemned this when it was going on. They were like, we're not okay with this. There's a degree right here of disciplining the body in a healthy way, or passing over into abuse because of some kind of really primitive idea of God and the way God works in the world. And by the way, this is condemned. I mean, the theology behind this was blown up in the oldest book in the Bible, which is one of the oldest books that we have. Right, one of the oldest books in the world is the book of Job. it was written way before Genesis and Deuteronomy and those other kinds of texts in the Bible. It's the oldest book. Um, and the whole question is, Job has this disaster happen to him. It seems unfair, and from our perspective, it is unfair. Um, and his friends come along and say, what sin did you do? What evil did you do for this would fall on you? If you'll just repent, it'll get better. And Job's like, no, I didn't do anything wrong. And this whole book of Job is a contemplation on this apparent unfairness in the world, that things go wrong, bad things happen to good people, and not because people have done wrong. And this kind of primitive idea is still with us. It's still there. After 9/11, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson had a televised press conference thing. They were giving the evangelical perspective on this disaster, and they both said that 9/11 happened because of the sins of us. They blamed homosexuals and liberals, and which is like this has been a bad idea from day one. But you can see how people would go there. It's a very simplistic way of looking at the world. When disaster is happening to you and you can't find a reason for it, it can be very comforting to say it's my fault. And if I'll just suffer enough, I can do something about this. But once again, bad theology. It leads to bad things. It leads people to bad places. It's a distorted understanding of the way that God works in the world. Augustine, one of the early church fathers, talked about this repeatedly. And one of the accusations that the pagans leveled against Augustine and against Christianity was that bad things are happening to you guys. So your God can't be true. And Augustine, of course, pointed out bad things have been happening to you guys forever. You've been, when you were pagans. But he said that the way God works in disasters is on the inside, not necessarily on the outside, without discounting the possibility of miracles and God intervening. Augustine pointed out what happens to people on the inside when they go through these kinds of disasters. And you can see this at work too in the world. My wife works at the Children's Center in Bethany, where just terrible, horrible things have happened to children, and they're there for long-term rehab, or they're there for care because they have these devastating illnesses, or have had devastating accidents or things happen to them. And I promise you, that place is full of light and joy and peace. Augustine said, look what happens to people when they go through these bad things. Grace and peace and joy in the midst of disaster, to Augustine, that was what Christianity had to offer, as opposed to miraculous and magical deliverance from any kind of bad thing. But that's the theology of Catholicism when it comes to bad stuff that happens to people. There's another question about Catholic theology, deals with Mary and the devotion to Mary that you see in the Middle Ages. This also comes from a specific kind, a part of the theology of Catholicism, and it's called Communion of the Saints. And it basically goes this way, and of course to this very day, people accuse Catholics of worshiping Mary. That's not what's happening there. Communion of Saints, the communion of saints means that the saints, the people who have died in the faith, are still alive. They're not gone. They didn't disappear. We just don't see them anymore, right? They're not here right now, but they're somewhere else. But they're still alive. They're still more alive. They've passed over into that other realm. But being rational beings there, right? They're still people. They still care about us. And the idea is that the whole kingdom of heaven, right, expands from the earth all the way up into heaven. That the kingdom of God on earth is people walking around with skin on, right? But also, heaven is part of that kingdom as well. And the citizens of that kingdom, the citizens of that part of heaven, are still active. They still know about us. They still care about us. And so Catholics believe that you can ask people in heaven to pray for them, um, just like you'd ask a friend to pray for you, someone that you feel like is, you're having a tough time, things aren't going well, whatever is going on, and you just feel like you don't have it. And you ask someone to pray for you. Well, the idea is that the saints in heaven can do that for us as well. And Mary is the number one right up there. The idea is that Mary is the best person in the history of the world because she was chosen to be the mother of Jesus. And so that's what that comes from. And so this kind of devotion to Mary, devotion to the saints, comes out of that theology. Last question, where were women educated? And the answer is almost nowhere. This is another example of kind of the misogyny that is part of human culture and has been for all of recorded history that we know of. Women are generally not treated with equal dignity, and that was going on in the Middle Ages. And so your opportunities for education were very, very limited. But it was limited for most people, especially in the early Middle Ages, right? If you wanted to be a learned person, you had to go to the church. The church is who had all these documents and had could teach literacy. And this leads to the idea that we still have these medieval institutions with us. The reason people traveled to the university in Paris was because that's where the teachers were. But more importantly, that's where the books were. The physical books that you could put your hands on and read. They were scarce, and they gathered them up into these libraries that were built like fortresses. One of the greatest disasters in the history of the world was the burning of the library in Alexandria in the ancient world. And we lost a whole lot of knowledge that otherwise we would have had. And so in the Middle Ages, like, we're not going to let this happen again. We're going to put these libraries together. We're going to collect as many books as we can. We're going to copy as many books as we can. And that's how civilization kind of rose out of the epidemic of ignorance that came after the fall of the earlier civilization. And so we still have this institution now, even though we don't need it, which is kind of weird. All this information is available online. You can teach yourself nearly anything now. But we still go to the university. And this is a very recent change, guys. When I went to school in 1985, there was no internet. And you had to go to the University of Oklahoma, is where I went to school, because that's where the library was. That's where you'd have the easiest access to the books that you wanted to put your hands on. And so we still do this. And it's kind of amazing. We still have the same terms, right? If you got a degree in the Middle Ages, you'd start out with a bachelor's degree. And then you could get a master's degree and a doctoral degree. We're still using those same terms. And so you guys are now participating in an odd way online with this medieval institution. And it kind of colors how we do things. I'm doing these video lectures, which I see that not very many people are accessing, which is, but I'm doing these because I don't think that online and no speaking to the professor and no input from someone that spent their life learning stuff is an adequate way of being educated. And so I try to make this, try to actually give you guys something that you may not see in the book. But this is all going to alter and change. We'll see how it shakes out. There's going to be some really, really big changes coming in terms of how education is done. Enormous changes. These institutions are failing. They don't know it yet, but they're failing. They've raised the prices, and they've caused people to get into massive debt. And this can't last very much longer. And so we'll see what shape it takes as an advent of the digital age and as these old medieval institutions kind of decay from the inside. Education as we know it will fall much like Rome did. It'll look great. It'll look great. It's like, oh, all these schools and universities and and then one day it's just all going to blow up. And we'll find out that it was hollowing out and becoming less and less vital for many years, and nobody really noticed. But that's what's happening. And the last thing I'll say today, it's a side issue related to that, be careful with student loan debt. Please do not come out of school with a degree in something you cannot make a living in. um, and owing $60,000, $100,000 in student loan debt. Do not do that. It will wreck your life. And a shocking number of young people are doing that, which is another reason this is all going to come crashing down in the very near future. And we'll be here to see what that looks like. And we're living through changes, just like we're reading in this book. We're living through these changes that will have an impact for centuries and centuries to come. Okay, I will see you guys next week. We're getting to the end. 2 weeks left after this one, so we're right up against it. Please start being more diligent. Some of you, I'm not taking everybody, but see people are missing assignments, missing questions, missing essays. Don't do it. It's not. It hurts your grade. So that's that. I'll see you next week.